So, good afternoon, boa tarde, bonjour, and I welcome you to this event on the EU Economic and Budgetary Outlook for 2021, putting Europe on the road of recovery. My name is Etienne Basso. I'm the Director of the Members Research Service at EPRS, and I'd like to extend a particular welcome to our guest today, Vice President Pedro Silva Pereira. Mr. José Manuel Fernandez, Member of the European Parliament, will join us in a few minutes. Chinta Alcidi from CEPS, Luis de Mello from OECD, and Nora Milotaya, our own expert in the EPRS for this event. And I welcome you wherever you are in Europe to this event. I said this is the fifth time that we issue the Economic and Budgetary Outlook at the EPRS. But this year, for this event, there is a particular reason to look at the economic issues in their link to the budgetary means of the European Union, since last year there was a breakthrough on the Recovery Fund and Next Generation EU. So we are going to have this discussion today, as said, with our experts, and we're going to start with the Vice President of the European Parliament, Mr. Pedro Silva Pereira. He has been member of the European Parliament for the S&D Group for Portugal since 2014. He is Vice President of the Parliament with responsibility for the EP budget, the European Citizen Initiative, neighbourhood policy, and relations with the multilateral financial institution, namely the IMF and the World Bank. He is a member of the Parliament's Committee for Economic and Monetary Affairs, Econ and Constitutional Affairs Committee, as well as a substitute member of the Parliament's Committee on International Trade, INTA, and a member of the delegation for the relation with Japan. From 2002 to 2014, he was member of the Portuguese Parliament, Assembleia da República, serving as Minister for Premiership from 2005 to 2011. So, Vice President, we are very honored to have you with us today. Up to you.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone. Let me begin by greeting you, Mr. Etienne Basso, Director of the Members Research Service at the EPRS, and also our distinguished guests. For me, it's a pleasure to be back to an event organized by EPRS after participating in two very interesting debates with the IMF and the World Bank. I believe this is a good sign that EPRS is delivering and helping the Parliament in its work. In a way, the event today goes in the same line of the previous two. Today we will continue our discussion on the near future, mostly on the economic domain, trying to look at the predictions indicated in the EPRS study, and also to reflect on the instruments and policies to address the challenges we face and ensure a socio-economic recovery. Well, as you said, this is already the fifth edition of the EPRS annual study on the economic and budgetary situation of the EU, which has, I can say, probably become one of its flagship publications, and certainly a useful document for our work here in the Parliament. As you may have had the chance to analyze, the study is structured in four parts, two on the economy and two on the budget. The first part provides mostly an in-depth summary of the economic forecasts of the European Commission, IMF, and the OECD, giving an overview of the main figures on GDP growth, and on employment, and also on public finances and even trade. Then the study goes on to present the EU budget, its nature, its role, on the second part, and the design of EU finances after 2021, and namely the IMF and this new financial package on the third part. And then on the last part, for of course obvious reasons, the focus is on EU social and employment policies in the context of the current pandemic. I'm sure that our debate later on will focus more thoroughly on the OECD's most recent projections for the EU and the euro area, and will allow us to discuss deeply the implications of the challenges we face and the policies we need to ensure proper recovery. Nonetheless, I hope I can already provide some input regarding what I consider the EU should focus on in order to boost economic recovery after the pandemic, and addressing some relevant social concerns and existing inequalities. Now, the three main economic outlooks from the IMF, the OECD, and the European Commission all estimate a significant drop in GDP for the EU and euro area in 2020, with very small differences between them. They all point to a decrease around 7% of GDP in the EU. This, of course, compares to a decrease of 4.4% worldwide, according at least to the IMF projections, or 4.2 if we follow the OECD projections. Now, despite the general overall negative impact of the crisis, I believe the main issue is the asymmetry of this impact. While, of course, COVID-19 hits all member states, its impact on their economies varies significantly, with some member states experiencing GDP drops of 3–4%, others of about 10%. And of course, the room of maneuver from the budgetary point of view of member countries to respond to the crisis is quite different. So of course, these asymmetries, we know they were already there, but they are even more significant now, and we can say they are becoming worse. Then the estimations for this year, 2021, seem to be more positive a little bit. We see estimates of a rebound in 2021 of about 4%. Some talk about 3% on 2022. But considering what we are already seeing, all these estimates, unfortunately, must be dealt with extreme caution, as the scenario all across Europe is still of great uncertainty. The estimated growth in GDP will depend on several factors, the main ones being, of course, the resolution of the sanitary and health crisis, the speed of the rollout of vaccines, and the effect of the new strains of the virus will play, of course, a role on the time and strength of this rebound. It comes as no surprise to anyone, I believe, that the coronavirus crisis has put an end to a multi-year streak of positive employment trends. Employment is expected to peak this year at 8.6% in the EU, and the figures for youth employment is even worse. In fact, the double, currently around 16%. Just like for the general economic outlook, the decrease of unemployment is, of course, also highly dependent on the pandemic recovery, plus the timing of expiry of extraordinary work schemes, the speed of reallocation of employees from the more hit sectors to the more resilient ones. And this is particularly true for the service sectors. I think on industries such as the tourism industry, and it is difficult to foresee when the tourism sector will be able to recover. Another major consequence of the pandemic-induced economic crisis is the unprecedented fiscal support by national authorities, so as to protect workers and businesses from the crisis caused by the pandemic. Now, these measures were accompanied by significant action in EU level, we must acknowledge that, including the activation for the first time of the general escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact. In 2020, almost all member states are projected to breach the 3% deficit, of course, and of course also the debt will increase all over Europe. To boost inflation on the other hand, but also to support the economies of the member states, the European Central Bank is playing, of course, a very crucial role by continuing its asset purchase program, launching a new massive pandemic emergency purchase program, and taking further accommodative measures, and also other important macro-prudential policies in order to keep financial stability and to avoid a new sovereign debt crisis. So now looking to the near future, I would say that the main concern will be naturally to ensure that the vaccines will be distributed equally among rich and developing countries, if I may underline, and of course within the European Union in a centralized and coordinated manner. In fact, we have to coordinate in various fronts the response to the COVID-19 challenge. This is, in fact, what the European Parliament is calling for. The virus knows no boundaries and needs to be fought everywhere with the same intensity. Now, on the economic front, which is more the theme of our discussion, the ongoing resurgence of infections, the new COVID-19 variants across the continent, and the pace and scope of the vaccination presents the biggest uncertainties in the near future. And I believe we can already say that some of the downside risks that were identified in the estimates will probably materialize in 2021. With all these restrictive measures that are being adopted, new lockdowns everywhere, the downside risks will most probably materialize. So 2021 tends to be worse than expected. I believe this is the first something we have to recognize. So how can we respond to this? How can we promote economic growth in these difficult circumstances? I believe the first message, the first political message I would like to deliver is that we must ensure full alignment between the current expansionary monetary policy and our fiscal and investment policy. Only with this alignment, something that, by the way, didn't happen in the previous financial crisis, we can respond to this enormous challenge. For that to happen, some conditions have to be met. First, the general escape clause, I believe it must remain suspended until we begin seeing a significant recovery and we reach the economic growth, the pre-crisis economic growth. Because otherwise, countries will be in a difficult position to promote the fiscal policy and the investments they need in order to meet the challenges we face. Secondly, we have to ensure that the money that was agreed in this financial package reaches the real economy. This is the challenge of the Portuguese presidency of the Council. And the idea is that we have to approve all the regulations and all the 27 national plans as soon as possible, preferably until the end of the first semester, so that money can reach the real economy. And of course, we have to make use of the front loading of the 13% that was also agreed, and all the other financial instruments available. This is the way that we can implement an economic response that is really quite different from the one we gave to the last financial crisis. And the third and final issue has to do with inequalities, because besides aligning our new investments with our long-term and medium-term goals in terms of Green Deal, fighting climate change, energy transition, and digital transition, we have to address issues related with poverty, inequalities, and we have to insist on the need for convergence at the EU level, because this is of paramount importance for the European project to be aligned with the expectations of our citizens. This has to be taken into account. And final remark to say that behind all these economic and financial instruments, we have other elements that are important for our economic response, namely on the international front, our trade agenda, the end of the trade war now that Mr. Trump is out of the White House, the relaunch of the transatlantic relations, the investment in multilateralism and international cooperation for development. This is also part of our strategy for an economic recovery. So many challenges ahead of us. I hope that we can, in face of these challenges, ensure that finally the European project delivers results and meets the expectations of citizens. We have the instruments, we have the political will, we have the strategy. Let's do it. Time to act, so says the Portuguese presidency, and rightly so. Thank you so much. Looking forward for our debate.
Thank you so much, Vice President, for this presentation, for not only presenting a very comprehensive panorama of the economic situation, but also looking at the challenges the EU is going to face in this recovery phase. I'm going now to turn to our second speaker, Monsieur José Manuel Fernandez. Vous êtes député au Parlement européen pour l'Espagne depuis 2009. Vous siégez au groupe du PPE. Vous étiez pardon, du Portugal, bien entendu. Excusez-moi. Vous étiez coordinateur de votre groupe pour l'équipe de négociation sur le cadre financier pluriannuel et les ressources propres. Au Parlement, vous êtes aussi le président de la délégation pour les relations avec le Brésil, et sous la précédente législature, vous aviez été aussi rapporteur sur le plan Juncker, je crois que c'était en 2016. Vous êtes enfin membre de la commission économique et monétaire et de la commission spéciale pour la délinquance financière et l'évasion fiscale. À vous, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, et je remercie l'invitation. Je voudrais saluer mon collègue Pedro Silva Pereira et tous les éléments que je vois et quelques-uns que je reconnais et que j'ai eu le plaisir de travailler avec, notamment dans les questions budgétaires. Bon, un remercie aussi au travail que vous faites et qui est essentiel et remarquable et d'une grande qualité et qui est très utile pour les députés pour prendre les meilleures décisions. Mais je vais immédiatement rentrer dans le cadre financier pluriannuel, dans le Next Generation EU, et comment les utiliser pour faire face à cette crise. En disant une première chose, on a toujours un problème dans les négociations budgétaires. Un budget petit, environ 1% du GNI, et un budget que, malgré sa grande valeur ajoutée, seulement ou moins de 7% sont pour les dépenses de fonctionnement et administratives, le Conseil, les États membres regarde toujours le budget comme une dépense. C'est 93% d'investissement, mais il le regarde comme une dépense. Sans ce budget, comment est-ce qu'on aurait pu répondre aux crises comme celle qu'on a de la pandémie, aux vaccins? Comment est-ce qu'on aurait pu répondre même à la crise migratoire? Un budget petit, on veut faire tout avec ce budget, et un budget que, comme je le dis, toute négociation est la preuve, les États membres regardent toujours le budget comme une dépense, presque comme un problème, quand la vérité, c'est que le budget est une solution et on ne l'utilise pas comme on devrait l'utiliser. Cadre financier pluriannuel. On a de 2014 à 2020 presque la moitié de la politique de cohésion qui n'a pas encore été exécutée. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire? États membres, dépêchez-vous, utilisez l'argent. Dans mon pays, on a plus de 11 milliards d'euros encore pour utiliser, malgré la flexibilité. Et après juillet de 2020, on peut même avoir pas seulement la flexibilité, mais l'argent à 100%. Il y a beaucoup d'argent encore à utiliser. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire pour cadre financier 2021-2027? Dépêchez-vous aussi, parce qu'on a besoin de l'approbation par la Commission de ce qu'on appelle les accords de partenariat. Et ces accords de partenariat doivent refléter une stratégie et maintenant, ils doivent être liés. On doit avoir des synergies aussi avec les plans nationaux pour l'instrument de récupération et de résilience. Vous savez que ça va de 2021 à 2027, le cadre financier pluriannuel, et que le fonds de relance, l'instrument pour la relance, il va fonctionner jusqu'à 2026. Tous les projets doivent être exécutés jusqu'à 2026 et doivent être approuvés jusqu'à 2023. On a besoin de convergence, mais on a besoin aussi de cohésion territoriale, économique et sociale. Il ne faut jamais l'oublier. Une chose intéressante, quelle est la stratégie du cadre financier pluriannuel 2021-2027? Quelqu'un peut me répondre? Parce qu'on savait bien que la stratégie de 2014-2020, c'était la stratégie Europe 2020. Quelle est notre stratégie? Je pourrais dire, dans mon opinion, que c'est une stratégie Europe 2020+, où on a les mêmes objectifs, priorités et actions, mais où on renforce le Green Deal, l'élément de l'environnement. Ce n'est pas par hasard que le cadre financier pluriannuel, c'est 30% pour le climat et le plan de relance, 37% pour le climat et 20% pour le digital et aussi la biodiversité. 2021-2027, c'est 7% et demi, mais on veut qu'à la fin, ça soit 10% du budget. Une grande préoccupation qui est bien visible pour le Green Deal. Bon, il faut savoir comment utiliser bien cet argent. Il faut bien le dépenser. Dans beaucoup d'États membres, cet argent représente plus de 80% de l'investissement public. C'est le cas de mon pays, le Portugal. Et il faut bien l'utiliser. Et il faut l'utiliser aussi, et ça, c'est ce qui a manqué, il faut l'utiliser aussi pour avoir des biens publics européens. On regarde le cadre financier pluriannuel et le Next Generation EU, c'est 1800 milliards d'euros. La question aussi est pourquoi on a besoin du Next Generation EU? Parce qu'on n'a pas pu et on ne pouvait pas renforcer le cadre financier pluriannuel parce que les États membres n'avaient pas de l'argent suffisant. C'est vrai. Mais on a une autre raison. C'est que tous les États membres veulent regarder presque tout, le Next Generation EU comme une chose très temporaire. Et pour eux, le budget, c'est toujours 1% du GNI. Ils ne veulent pas plus. Et c'est ici aussi qui rentre la façon comment on finance le budget. C'est presque tout, 85% des recettes qui viennent, en fonction du GNI et de la TVA, qui viennent des budgets nationaux. Seulement 15% sont des droits douaniers. Chaque État membre regarde le budget comme pas seulement une dépense, mais une chose où on veut reprendre l'argent qu'on met. I want my money back, le juste retour, qui après mène aussi à des choses qu'on doit complètement éviter, que c'est des contributeurs nets, les bénéficiaires nets, quand tous les États membres bénéficient du budget, et les États membres qui sont plus contre le budget sont ceux qui gagnent plus, notamment du marché interne de l'Union européenne. C'est à cause de ça qu'on a défendu les nouvelles ressources propres. Mais on la défend maintenant avec plus de vigueur. Pourquoi? Parce que les 750 milliards du Next Generation EU, du plan de relance, c'est un emprunt qui doit être payé. Maintenant, il n'y a pas beaucoup d'impact 2021-2027. 12,8, 12,9 milliards, 0,01% du budget. Mais après 2027, ça a un impact de 10% du budget, environ 15 milliards d'euros par an. Si on n'a pas de ressources propres, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Bon, une chose, c'était d'augmenter les contributions nationales, ça veut dire demander plus d'argent aux citoyens. Une autre chose, la plus probable, c'est les États membres disent on ne sort pas d'ici, c'est 1%, et on met cet argent, comme c'est le cas, dans le budget, le paiement de la dette. Ça veut dire une réduction annuelle de 10% du budget. Ce n'est pas acceptable. On ne peut pas couper l'avenir. On ne peut pas couper les politiques qui sont essentielles pour l'Union européenne. Et les politiques comme la politique de cohésion, elle est aussi une politique moderne. Ce n'est pas seulement le traditionnel. Elle aide aussi à la recherche. La politique agricole commune, elle est aussi essentielle, comme on le sait. Et c'est pour cela qu'on a eu des ressources propres. On a un accord contraignant. Il y a une chose ici très étrange. Les ministres des Finances des États membres n'ont pas compris qu'on a adopté un accord contraignant pour les nouvelles ressources propres. C'est vrai. Ils ne le savent pas. On doit envoyer cet accord interinstitutionnel qui est contraignant, où on a l'objectif, ressources propres, panier qui doit être suffisant pour le paiement de la dette. On a un calendrier et on a le nom des ressources propres. Le principe est simple, les ressources propres doivent être alignées avec les politiques européennes et on ne doit pas charger les citoyens. Ceux qui ne payent pas doivent payer. Une taxe sur le digital, les géants, c'est juste. Le Carbon Board Adjust Mechanism, le mécanisme d'ajustement de carbone aux frontières aussi, une taxe sur les transactions financières, la révision de l'ITS et aussi la possibilité d'avoir un autre objectif, c'est de combattre la fraude, l'évasion et l'élusion fiscale. Bon, on va avoir ici une autre bataille. Le cadre financier pluriannuel, vous savez que c'est unanimité au Conseil. Mais ressources propres, le Parlement n'a rien à dire, une opinion qui n'est pas contraignante, et le Conseil doit décider par unanimité, mais après les parlements nationaux doivent ratifier. C'est la preuve qu'il n'y a pas d'impôt européen, au contraire de ce que beaucoup de gens extrémistes le disent. Non, ce sont les parlements nationaux qui décident. Et avec ces nouvelles ressources propres, qui sont aussi alignées et qui sont amis de l'environnement, on peut avoir plus pour faire mieux et avoir plus pour des politiques qui sont essentielles. Et une des politiques essentielles, ce sont aussi des politiques européennes. Pourquoi on n'investit pas plus dans la recherche? Quel est le coût de ne pas investir dans la recherche? On va avoir, chaque État membre va avoir un programme de recherche? Non. On a besoin de ce programme de recherche. Heureusement, on l'a renforcé dans les négociations. On n'a pas besoin d'une union d'énergie et d'une union ferroviaire et d'une union digitale, oui. Connect Europe Facility. Le Erasmus+, c'est pas un programme de succès, oui. On n'a pas la preuve qu'on a besoin d'une union géopolitique. Elle est où, l'union géopolitique? On ne sait pas bien qu'on a besoin d'un programme de santé renforcé. Les vaccins ne sont pas la preuve qu'on peut et on doit être solidaire, mais aussi agir ensemble. Ce n'est pas seulement agir vite, c'est aussi agir et avoir une action qui doit être ensemble. Et je vous donne ce chiffre. 1800 milliards d'euros. Qu'est-ce qu'ont fait les États membres? Ils l'ont divisé dans des enveloppes nationaux. 93%, c'est pour les enveloppes nationaux. Pour les programmes européens, 7%. InvestEU, ils l'ont réduit complètement. On a ajouté dans les négociations 1 milliard d'euros pour mobiliser 400 milliards d'euros 2021-2027. Un programme très important, ce sont des instruments financiers où les États membres ont la possibilité, par exemple, et grâce au Parlement, d'avoir un instrument de solvabilité pour les entreprises au niveau national. C'est ici que je fais des questions aussi. Quels sont les États membres qui veulent cet instrument financier? Ils peuvent l'avoir. Ils peuvent utiliser de l'argent du Next Generation EU pour mettre dans le compartiment national de InvestEU pour créer un instrument de solvabilité pour les PME. Et on sait bien la difficulté à ce moment qu'on a des petites et moyennes entreprises qui sont viables du point de vue économique, mais qui sont en difficulté à cause de la pandémie. Mais on a les fenêtres dans InvestEU qui est l'infrastructure soutenable, les PME, le social et aussi la recherche et l'innovation. Mais le Conseil a coupé la fenêtre que la Commission avait proposée, qui était les investissements stratégiques. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Ils n'ont pas compris, ils n'ont pas retiré les leçons de la crise. Parce que pour pouvoir répondre au niveau européen, par exemple, en termes des vaccins et des mutations qu'on a maintenant, il faut plus de recherche. Parce qu'on a besoin des programmes européens comme ceux que j'ai dit et on a renforcés, mais ils ne sont pas suffisants. Et ça, c'est de l'investissement. Et ça, ce n'est pas des dépenses, au contraire, de la façon que chaque État membre regarde ce budget. Et même avec cette pandémie, on n'a pas encore compris qu'on a besoin de ces investissements stratégiques, de cette souveraineté pour un, et d'autres, ils l'appellent autonomie. Mais c'est une question d'avoir effectivement cette Union européenne géopolitique. On a des outils, on a ce cadre financier pluriannuel, on a encore le cadre financier pluriannuel oublié 2014-2020, où la politique de cohésion, plus de 300 milliards d'euros, sont à la moitié. On a ces instruments financiers et bien sûr qu'on a aussi ce Next Generation EU, ce plan de relance que j'espère maintenant que les États membres, après la question du blocage à cause de l'état de droit, puissent adopter, ratifier rapidement, et c'est urgent, les citoyens ont besoin, et j'espère que dans le futur, les chefs d'État puissent comprendre une chose très simple. Budget européen, c'est investissement, ce n'est pas de dépenses. Merci.
Merci, Monsieur Fernandez, pour cette présentation riche en expérience personnelle et aussi en présentation des enjeux auxquels est confrontée l'Europe maintenant. Et l'un d'entre eux est l'urgence d'agir, de ratifier et ensuite d'agir et de faire le mieux possible avec ce plan de relance dans les États membres. Now we turn to our panel discussion, and I would like to introduce our moderator, who is Fabiette Jones. Fabiette Jones is a well-known expert in the European Parliament on budgetary issues. She is the head of the Budgetary Policies Unit in the EPRS, and before that, she had several positions in the Parliament, including the head of the Secretariat of the Budget Committee. So over to you, Fabiette, to introduce the panelists and the discussion.
Many thanks, Etienne. And for me too, I have to say what a pleasure it was to listen to Vice President Silva Pereira and Mr. Fernandez. It was a real, as you say, I was before in the Budget Committee, and it was a real pleasure to hear him again in this debate and hear his interesting words. So I can, so we've already started to receive questions. I mean, this is on these two rich presentations that we've already had. So I'm really looking forward to a great discussion later on. But first of all, we will turn to our panel, and then we'll take the questions and answers afterwards. Can I just remind the audience, to please don't hesitate to introduce more questions through our question and answer box at the side of the screen, or you can use the chat function if you wish. We monitor it, and thanks for the questions that we've already received. So the panel, we are going to start with the outlook of the economy as a whole, and we will start with Mr. Luis de Mello, and then we will focus in on the labour market and social policies. And this is the order of our experts, and I have great pleasure in turning to them now. And we will start with Mr. Luis de Mello, who is Director of Economic Policies at the OECD. And he will talk about the economic outlook. As you will all be aware, the OECD puts out an economic outlook twice a year. It's one of the flagship publications of the OECD, and it focuses on the state of the world and includes economic projections for OECD member countries and major emerging markets, market economies outside the EU. Now, as we're all aware, the world economy has been shaped by the pandemic, and so will be the prospects for recovery over the next few months. So it's particularly timely to bring these perspectives into the conversation, and this is precisely what Mr. de Mello is going to address now. So, Luis, what's your take on the current economic situation and the outlook for the world and for the European economy?
Thank you very much, Fabia, for this introduction. I'm honored to join you today, and Etienne, also Vice President Silva Pereira, MEP Fernandes. It's a great pleasure to join you all and the panelists, Cinzia and Nora, on this occasion. Let me also start by congratulating the authors of the report for a very timely analysis and for raising very important issues for policy at the current juncture for Europe and beyond. I thought, Fabia, that I would start with a few points on how we see the outlook. I mean, you mentioned the OECD projections. Our latest numbers date back to December, so not too far ago. We are in the middle of revisiting some of those projections, and we will publish revised numbers in March. So we are halfway through our cycle, but I think a lot of what we said in December remains by and large valid now. Let me recap the key message that we put out a few weeks ago. There was basically, as Vice President Silva Pereira mentioned, that there was a message of basically better prospects for an eventual path out of the crisis for the global economy and for Europe as well. But at the same time, a message of considerable uncertainty about the actual shape, the actual numbers of the near-term outlook. You see, a few weeks back, the optimism that we observed in the numbers and in market sentiment was due to the fact that we were announcing the effectiveness of a number of vaccines, that countries were rolling out vaccination programs that would allow life to go back to normal. But since then, there has been news about these new mutations, variants of the virus, renewed outbreaks in many parts of the world, and the restrictions that were put in place again to deal with the spread of these new variants of the disease. Also, the logistical challenges in deploying the vaccine that now we see that how important they are, and that's obviously taking its toll on sentiment and on the recovery. So this is basically the backdrop. Some better prospects, but lots of challenges and uncertainty. The new restrictions that are being put in place on mobility are obviously slowing down the recovery. We saw that household spending was recovering very fast last year, in the latter part of last year. That improvement has basically stalled since then. Their industrial production is also recovering, but at a slow pace, and it remains pretty much below pre-pandemic levels. It's also the case of investment. It was mentioned before the importance of investment moving forward. There was a very sharp contraction in the spring, and still, despite some recovery, investment is still below pre-pandemic levels. Trade also recovering goods, but not so much in services, which is understandable given the fact that services are the sectors in our economies that have been hardest hit by the confinement measures. Labor market, Cinzia is going to come back to this point, but we see also a gradual recovery, but still considerable pressure. Hours worked remain weak relative to before the pandemic. Some of the numbers related to job vacancies that we are seeing coming up remain also very weak, and especially in those sectors, again, that have been hardest hit, especially services that require face-to-face interactions, as we all know. Other soft indicators of market sentiment also pointed to this loss of momentum that we have observed over the last few weeks. Some good news on the upside, if you wanted to think of upside risks. We see that now the impact of confinement measures on economic activity, that impact is not as strong as it was in the spring, in the early days of the pandemic. So I think we are doing a better job at maintaining economic activity to the extent possible in the face of new restrictions to mobility and so on. Also, we see in many parts of the world a very sharp increase in household savings. So people, because life is not the way it used to be, you're spending less, also for precautionary reasons, and given the uncertainty about the state of the world. So this could point to some scope for pent-up demand that can then sustain some of the pickup in consumption that we would hope in the recovery. So that's by and large, let's say, the forces acting, the drivers of the recovery. On actual numbers, we are pointing to our recovery growth in the global economy to the tune of 4.25% this year. That's against a drop of over 4% last year. For the euro area, we are looking at a growth in the neighborhood of 3.75% in 2021. That's against a drop of over 7% that we anticipated for last year. So some recovery, but still we're going to be in a situation where many countries and many parts of the world will still have levels of output at the end of this year that will be lower than what we had before the pandemic hit. So a long way for a meaningful recovery that can create the type of durable, high-quality jobs that we'll need to get out of this crisis.
Many thanks, Luis, for setting out the picture for us and the outlook for the economy. Could I ask a follow-up question? What, in your opinion, are the most important challenges we're going to need to deal with moving forward?
Fabian, this is really the key question for policy moving forward. Let me highlight a few of them, and then we can probably come back to these issues in the Q&A and later on. I think one point to bear in mind, it's the huge heterogeneity that we see in the outlook across countries. You take China and some of the emerging markets outside the euro area and outside Europe, they're recovering much faster than countries in Europe. But as I said, still by and large, for the euro area, our numbers point to some gap of 3 to 5% in terms of the level of output at the end of this year relative to before the pandemic. So that's one. Heterogeneity also across sectors and people. If you look at the sectors most adversely affected, hospitality, transport, entertainment, some services, they account for about 15–20% of employment in our economies. So a big chunk of the economy and a big chunk of employment there. And if you look within those sectors, about 40%, according to our estimations, of employment in those sectors basically refer to vulnerable people, part-timers, people on temporary contracts, the self-employed. So I'm mentioning this because I think Cinzia and Nora will come back to that. That creates a lot of challenges for employment and social protection policies moving forward. Another point that is worth making is that we'll need to continue providing support moving forward, probably increasingly in a targeted manner, so focusing on those sectors that are lying behind, the vulnerable workers, the viable firms that are under most stress right now. What is important here is really to avoid a premature removal of support while the economy is still fragile, because that's one of the lessons that we took from the global financial crisis, that withdrawing support too early will basically undermine the recovery. Another point that I think is important is to think of the reallocation needs to underpin the recovery. We know there are sectors that will recover much more slowly than others. There are businesses that will fail. There are workers that will be displaced. So how can we make sure that the recovery creates opportunities for those displaced workers, to create opportunities for capital, right, for investment to take place in the sectors that will recover faster and that will be more promising in the economy that will emerge from this crisis. Now, we don't want again to come back to the situation we had after the global financial crisis of a lot of capital trapped in firms that were not viable, workers that could be displaced and then find themselves in long-term unemployment or drop out of the labor force altogether. So we want to avoid that as we move forward. And another point, and I'll stop here, is let's not forget the pre-existing challenges. Low productivity growth before the pandemic hit, population aging, inequalities, the digital transformation, climate change, so many others that were there before we were saddled with COVID-19. We need to come out of it, and we need to make sure that we address what was there before, because the crisis, COVID-19, is exacerbating. Thank you.
Thanks. Well done, Luis. You made it just until your connection started to go funny. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was great. Now, you mentioned, and also did Vice President Silva Pereira mention in particular problems faced by the labour market. And so I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our next panelist, Cinzia Alcidi, Director of Research and Head of the Jobs and Skills Unit at CEPS, who brings a particularly expert knowledge of developments in the labour market to this discussion. So, Cinzia, may I ask you, what has been the impact of the pandemic on the labour market, and what kind of recovery can we expect?
Good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks, Fabia, for the introduction, and I'm really honored to be part of this panel. And I would like to follow up on some of the that were made earlier on, especially a few points which were raised by Vice President Silva Pereira and also by Luis. You both gave an overarching overview of the economic situation and what are the risks. And you both mentioned some of the issues related to the labor market. It's quite interesting that, and I find it quite a difference compared to the financial crisis, when the focus was not only but a lot on measuring GDP fall. Now, to some extent, we talk about 10 percentage point GDP fall, but actually all the eyes are mostly on the labor market. And the situation on the labor market, to some extent, is still quite uncertain. It is uncertain because if we look at the traditional indicators of the state of the labor market, like unemployment or employment, indicators have moved. So unemployment has increased, employment has declined and then increased again. But the changes have been very modest compared to what happened to GDP. In fact, if we want to get a sense, and Louise already mentioned this, of actual dynamics on the labor market, we need to look for all the indicators. And these are essentially the hours worked and the layoffs, the temporary layoffs. And basically, if you look at both these indicators, you see an abrupt fall in hours worked, and then a recovery in quarter 3 of 2020. I have to say that for the labor market, the most recent data that we have is for quarter 3 of 2020. So basically, we do not have the last 3 months of the year, which is usually quite short period, but now with the COVID, even 3 months seem very long, and a lot of events actually could happen. So we are all looking at the updates. But basically, what we've seen in this quarter is basically a recovery in the hours worked, but not the level of the end of 2019. And similar but opposite behavior is in the layoffs. So layoffs are usually quite stable, and then there was a huge increase basically in quarter 2, a fall in quarter 3, but not yet back to the level of before COVID. So this is basically just to say that there is something going on in the labor market, but a number of measures which have been put in place by national governments have basically are hiding, if you want, or reducing the movements on the labor market. And this is the very objective, basically, of such policies, in particular these short-term work schemes, which were financed by national governments, but also by the SURE at European level. So in practice, what we expect is that until these measures are in place, and we do not know exactly until when will be in place, changes, variations on the labor market should be contained, at least to a certain extent. Now, the big question mark, and I think this is really the main challenge and the main question we will try to respond is what will happen afterwards. And in particular, whether the changes or the movements that we are seeing now are just temporary shock, long but still temporary shock, or whether COVID basically will materialize as a permanent shock on the labor market. Now, if it is, even if long, a temporary shock, the idea would be that those workers who have not been able to work because of social distancing measures, hairdresser, in Belgium have been closed by more than 3 months. So it's clear that in February we will not go for an haircut that we didn't do in December. Once we go back to normality, everyone will go back to his or her own job. So in this sense, not permanent changes will happen. However, and this was mentioned also by Louise, in the downside risk that we can imagine is that some of the changes and some of the dynamics which are observing in the labor market are there to stay. In addition to this, the longer is the crisis, the more difficult will be for businesses who have not been able to operate or to operate a full regime to basically remain viable. And this will be a very key challenge, and will pose very fundamental questions, not only about the support, which of course should remain in place until COVID is on, but also on what kind of economic structure we are going to see basically the main shock is over.
Many thanks, Cinzia. I would like to ask you a follow-up question, if I may, and that concerns the acceleration of a major pre-existing trend that we already saw, digitalization and the way we work, which has obviously changed in a very rapid way during this pandemic. What are the main challenges for workers stemming from this?
I mean, of course, has been also an opportunity for some workers. I think we are all able to work because of digital tools. I mean, this is for us has been a change, and for many people a change in the way we work. But in the end, because of technology, we have been able to continue to perform all our tasks. Now, on the other side, while digitalization and automatization of processes was already going on, COVID has accelerated the process. So basically, it's likely to make transition shorter. And if transition is shorter, the cost of the losers of transitions, there are always losers in transition, actually may be higher, and they may be more difficult actually to prepare for the new world or the new situation after the transition. And basically what we have been experiencing is that it was mentioned already earlier that certain sectors, the tasks were teleworkable, or it was possible to move to a digital approach, have been taking the opportunity to do so. If you think of delivery of food, if you think of online shopping, we all realized that actually we could buy online, or we could buy the ticket to go to a cinema when it's open, just online. This will imply that a lot of jobs and tasks will be very unlikely to return to be performed by people and contact kind of occupations. And this will pose a very fundamental question, which is very much linked to the capacity and the skills that people have in order to transform their tasks for instance, in-person task to a digital version, but also to move possibly from one sector to another. This was already mentioned by Mr. Pereira and Luis. So the sectoral reallocation will be really a very fundamental challenge. Now, there is quite a lot of debate, and the OECD has done a huge amount of work about the role of skills. And also in the European context, that there is a growing debate about the role of skills. The Commission published a new EU skills agenda just last year. If you look at the document of the industrial policy, industrial strategy for the EU, there is reference to the role of skills. So there is a broad agreement on the fact that we need to make sure that people have the right skills to keep their job, they have the right skills to move to another job in case they are displaced. Now, a much more fundamental question is about how to implement this and how to target when we have a policy of upskilling or reskilling. And here I think one very important element is that there is a huge variety at the level of the member states on the approach to re-qualified people, to improve the qualifications or the skills of people. And this may be a very fundamental challenge also in terms of convergence. Some Nordic countries, for instance, have invested a lot in upgrading the skills of their people, for instance, in the public sector. In other countries, mostly I have to say Southern European countries and also my home country, until recently, the focus has always been on tertiary education. Now, the strategy of big investment on tertiary education has worked up to a certain point, but it may not be what we need to respond to this crisis, but also to deal with very fundamental transformations which were ongoing independently of COVID. And on this, maybe just one final point, which relates actually to the pre-COVID period. I've been looking at flows of people within the European Union, and basically the degree of education of these people. And from there, actually, it was quite clear that while the people from east to west were basically very widespread in terms of educational achievements, from primary, secondary, and tertiary, what it happened in the flows from the south to the north is that those living had mostly tertiary education. So in this sense, those policies which focused very much on tertiary education sometimes were not able to deliver and to generate economic growth as it was expected to happen. And actually, a lot of people left the countries. I think we really need to make sure that this will not happen anymore. So my message is, I'm not saying that tertiary education is not important, not at all. But I think when we talk about qualifications, when we talk about skills, it's certainly not only about tertiary education, but it's much beyond that. It's a concept which actually applies to the whole life of people, also when they are part of the workforce. And I will stop it here and happy to discuss this further.
Many thanks, Cinzia, for that really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Right, so now we turn to our final panelist, Nora Milotai, who is a policy analyst in the Members Research Service of the European Parliamentary Research Service, specialising in social and employment policies. And you will be aware that this year's edition of the Economic and Budgetary Outlook had a special focus on social policies, which was written indeed by Nora. And Nora's work focuses mainly on issues of social protection, governance and innovation. So, Nora, we've heard the details of a rather complex outlook for the economy, the labour market and society at large. So where do you see the role in all of this for the EU social and employment policies in this complex outlook? And can you perhaps tell us what you think is the potential role of EU policies to address the challenges raised by the other speakers in this event? Microphone.
So thank you very much for giving me the floor, and a good afternoon, everybody. And I also feel very honored to be part of this distinguished panel, real honor. And I would like to then address your questions. So indeed, Fabia, we have heard very complex issues. And I would say that the answer, when we focus on social and employment policies, but also on the broader picture of other policies that are relevant for society and for updating welfare states and labor markets, I think the tools are also very complex. So just to sum up, what we heard so far is the words that we heard so many times is heterogeneity between the countries, between regions, between groups of people. I would say it's the same about inequalities, and all this, the risk of leading to divergence instead of convergence. So this is something that was really emphasized in all the contributions. I think one of the lessons that we have learned is that it is very clear that if we want to put in place policies that will help productivity and growth, we have to link them together with also redesigning the social contract. We already in the last 20 years, we have seen a shift between individuals and institutions, where individuals had to take care of their outcomes increasingly more and more as savers, as consumers, and as workers. And this has been, of course, good for some groups, like the high-skilled, the high earners, and not so good for the low-skilled, for the young, for example. So now in this crisis, we really see that the economic and the social crisis are completely intertwined. At the same time, within this lots of problems and dark picture, we also see some opportunities, I think. For instance, if we think about small businesses, they were very, very hardly hit. But if we have the right policies, they might become engines, for example, in the recovery, because local economies closer to the home might become very important. It's the same if we think about care workers. This profession had actually, it's not a very good quality job, it's not well paid. We have understood in this pandemic how important it is, whether it goes to elderly care, whether it goes to childcare. And so this is also an opportunity to think about policies to change the profile of this profession and to have better quality jobs for this profession. So to these complex issues, as I said, the policies that we can use are also very complex, and I really want to emphasize that social and employment policies are very much intertwined, as we have heard already, with other policy areas. So a lot of other policy areas have an impact on welfare states and the labor markets. So the budget is one tool that we have, and actually, as we discussed in the publication, 3/4 basically of the multi-annual financial framework can be used directly or indirectly for initiatives that would help in this process. But of course, and now with the next generation of EU, this amount is even bigger. But of course, the budget in itself is just one of the tools. It's also very important that there are targets. There are policy initiatives at European level where we set minimum standards, we set targets, and we link those to the funds and to the usage of the funds. And finally, the third pillar, let's say, of these tools is the EU's economic governance that has a huge impact on social and employment policies. And what I would say is that all these tools together basically can create a policy space in which we can, let's say, European policies can incentivize, not carry out, but incentivize reforms and innovation. Some would argue that it can be the European policy space can be regarded basically as a holding space that on the one hand mitigates the stress it can put on welfare states, and at the same time it can also help to incentivize reform in the different member states. One example for this very strong, for how strongly the social and economic aspects are intertwined and the different tools can be used together is the regulation basically on the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the biggest part of the next generation of EU, which really emphasizes basically in an equal manner the importance of economic and social recovery at the same time, at focusing on the vulnerable, about bringing about cohesion again, etc. And also when it comes to the semester as a tool to monitor the process and also to bring it forward, it puts a very big emphasis on the European Pillar of Social Rights, on achieving the goals basically of the European Pillar of Social Rights and also the Sustainable Development Goals.
Many thanks, Laura. So now we understand the potential of existing EU policy tools combined with the next generation instruments. But a follow-up question I would have for you is, how can we make sure that these policies, these EU policies, support positive changes on the ground?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, that is actually the most important thing of basically what will happen in the localities, in the countries. And here I think, first of all, we really have to, the first thing I would emphasize is that we need to understand what we mean under our objectives. So we really emphasize that the new buzzwords are resilience and sustainability. Here I would first of all emphasize that sustainability is really not only economic and environmental sustainability, but it also has to mean social sustainability. And what social sustainability means is that everybody's well-being needs to be preserved across generations, across regions, across countries. So we need to have an agreement and an understanding of that. Then it is also very important that we basically go for the right policy choices, that we really we use those instruments and we choose those directions where EU policies can really have an impact. And here I would give 3 examples that I think that comes out of my readings and research that might be useful. One is really to help to improve member states' governance structures. What do we mean by these governance structures? There is an indicator by the World Bank, which is a worldwide governance indicator, that defines several elements of this governance structure, but it means basically the quality of government regulations, the rule of law, the control of corruption, the political stability, that all these factors really impact how governance in a country works. Why is this important? There are studies that show actually that depending on the effectiveness of governance, there is a strong correlation between poverty levels, let's say, and the effectiveness of governance. Actually, there is much more correlation than, let's say, between social spending and poverty levels. But coming to the pandemic, there are also studies that show that there where governance was less effective, the GDP has dropped much more. So what does this mean in practice? In practice, this basically means to focus on really, let's say, reforming or improving public administration, so that there is no fraud, so that there is no corruption, and at the same time also to put in place financial regulations and institutions that allow to remove administrative bottlenecks, so that there are good public procurement systems in place, that there is a possibility for public-private partnerships. So this is one area where I think the EU can have an impact, governance. The other area would be, beside governance, is social investment. So to really think about the 3 pillars of the welfare state, and we have heard here earlier by Cynthia particularly about the importance of education and skills. So these 3 pillars are, on the one hand, investing into human capital. So this means education and training across the board. The other pillar is activation. So to really help those who lost their jobs, but also to help transitions on the labor market or from education to the labor market. And finally, to protect those who are vulnerable. So all the 3 elements. This is particularly important, I would say, for 2 reasons. One is we have heard how much, for instance, the young were impacted by this pandemic. And so if we generate more pro-child, pro-family, pro-youth policies, this also helps to balance out the welfare states, which actually in many instances focuses much more and spends much more on the older people. Another aspect is that there is a very big danger of long-term unemployment. We have heard that also, whether this will be something just now or whether this will be something permanent. And long-term unemployment is really something that has big economic, apart from the personal consequences, it has also big economic consequences. So this would be my second point. And then the last point, and this is where I will stop, is that so beside governance and social investment, another direction would be technology, not to look at technology as something to really change the conversation, and not to look at technology as something that we need to adapt to, but technology as a possibility that can augment actually the skills also of the low skills. So not only, let's say, if you think about teachers, not adjust the technological the technologies to the star teachers, but actually to have technologies that help the, let's say, not so advanced teachers to adjust, to customize, to individualize their teaching to their students and to develop the right skills. Or another example could be to really generate, which actually the EU has projects like that, to create platforms that can be digital platforms that brings together citizens and actually combines human and machine intelligence in order to solve societal problems or environmental problems or health problems. And actually we have seen also a lot of examples for those during the pandemic. So these are the three directions I would suggest here. And I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nora, and thanks to everybody for all these excellent presentations, and also thanks to the audience for the questions that we've had in, which we're about to put to our members. And I propose to put a question to each of the speakers in order, but before I do that, I would like to just pass the floor to our director, Etienne Bessot, who would like to kick off with the first question. Please, Etienne.
Thank you very much, Fabia, and thank you to all speakers. It has been a really enjoyable conversation. I just had many of you mentioned the question of the debt, and some analysts say that we are possibly heading to a debt crisis, and that could be an issue of a major risk for the European Union. So, my question is, how do you see this question, and maybe for Luis. Do you think that the growth that will inevitably come in the recovery will absorb that debt and that risk that is we are confronting, or it's going to be an issue for many years that will also be affecting the public decisions, public debate in general? Thank you.
Thanks, Etienne. I would add a few more questions before I hand the floor to the speakers to answer. Couple of you, many of you raised the issue of timing. So I would have a question to a few of you on timing. So starting with Mr. Silva Pereira and perhaps Luis as well. Luis, you said, in fact, you stressed that we should not have a premature removal of support. But in your opinion, and in the opinion of Vice President Silva Pereira, can we define the optimal timing for exiting the current programs? Because there is talk about if they stay in place too long, there's a risk of zombification. So perhaps you could talk a little bit, both of you, about this timing and issue. And on the timing question for Mr. Fernandez, you stressed how important it was that we get this Next Generation EU money and all the support from the EU budget in place quickly, that it's urgent. So I wondered if you could comment a bit on what's most important, speed or accuracy, if you know what I mean, because with EU programs, there's always so many conditions to fill, papers to form and all this kind of thing, which inevitably slows things down. So perhaps if you could talk a bit about that balance between speed and accuracy. I don't know if there's any friends from Budgetary Control Committee listening, but I leave you to deal with that. And then we have a very interesting question from the audience as well that I would put to Nora and Cinzia is, what would you say to teenagers today asking about their future? What can they expect? What are your views on this? So I would hand the floor in the order of the speakers, if that's okay, and ask please Mr. Vice President Silva Pereira to reply first to the various questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your questions, and also thank you to our guests for excellent presentations indeed. Now, your question about the timing, when should we abandon these stimulus measures? What I think it is of utmost importance is to recognize that we are really facing an unprecedented crisis. And as I said, unfortunately, 2021 will be most probably worse than expected. So what I am sure is that this is not the time to even consider to withdraw from this approach to the economy. And the initial idea of suspending this deficit and debt targets of the Sustainable Growth Pact by the end of the year really at this stage doesn't make sense. We have to prolong, from my point of view, the suspension of those rules. If you ask me, but for how long? Well, it depends on many things. It depends on the crisis itself. What I'm completely sure is that it would be a terrible mistake to do what, in fact, was done in the previous crisis, where the initial message was we have to invest, and then suddenly a change of course, and the consequences on the financial markets. Now, I do understand that the room of maneuver of member states is different, and they have to take that into account in choosing their financial instruments and measures. Yes, they have to take that into account. There's a responsible manner of addressing the crisis, no doubt about that. But the fundamental thing is that, in principle, we should only stop this general escape clause when we did, in fact, solve the fundamental problem, meaning that when we have again the level of economic growth that we had before the crisis. For me, this should be the principle. Now you asked me about collateral effects of this. Yes, there might be collateral effects. Fortunately, I think that we have now two instruments to avoid sovereign debt crisis as the one we had before. First, the support of the European Central Bank through the monetary policy, but also the nature of this response to the crisis, which is based on that issue by the European Commission itself that should be repaid on the basis of own resources, so with less burden for the national debt. Of course, national debt will increase, but I think we have there a safety net that can give us more hope. So we have to assess according with the evolution of the crisis. But what I am certain at this stage is that it would be a mistake to suspend this or to apply again the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact too soon.
Many thanks. Mr. Fernandez, would you like to comment, please?
Yes, and if you let me give a comment about what we are discussing also in social questions and education and skills. We talk about national competence. That's not European competence. And maybe we need more competences in these areas, and in the health And after we have a problem. We don't have targets and objectives at the European Union for the education. What is what in 2027? What is the target that we have? And when we talk about poverty, what is the target, and what is the target for each member state and for each region? I think we need to discuss about targets also and objectives in these areas. That's why I have asked what is our strategy, because before we have the European 2020 strategy and with targets and with objectives. I think we can have the same objectives, but we need to. I think we need to discuss these points, and we need to show also what we are doing with the funds, and because in a lot of member states they don't feel that the ESF that help to have better skills, and now we have an agreement in the SF plus, and this ESF plus is very important to combat the inequalities, and we need to show also and to learn with the best practices. We have a lot of work in this in these areas, but we can have the social if we have economy, if we have productivity, if we have competitiveness, if we have convergence, and I insist, territorial and social cohesion, and it is very important. Your question, fast or accurate? Fast and accurate, and we cannot lose more time. Remember, I was the rapporteur for the one resources decision. We have adopt our opinion in September, and the council have blocked the decision, and they have blocked the decision. Because the problem was the one resources decision. No, the problem was the regulation of the rule of law. That's unacceptable. That's impossible. And only in the end of December they start with the process, and now we are waiting for the ratification of the national parliament, and we are waiting, and it's urgent. But everyone needs to do their job, and I have underlined that the member states have a lot of money, and they need to execute this money of the cohesion policy of the MFF 2014-2020. They need to execute. We have more flexibility. They need to use these amounts, and they need to use also with a common perspective. But we cannot lose more time. And we cannot lose more time. It's urgent. That's why I say fast and accurate. And we need also, when the member states will present the partnership agreements, when, and the plans, the national plan for the resilience, and they are listen the regions. No, that's not true. And they are listen the beneficiaries. No, they are not listening. They need to listen, and they need to present plans and partnership agreements, both. And we are wasting time also in this in this point. And after I come back to the Next Generation EU, it's an unprecedented decision. We have not common debt, we have not Eurobonds, but we have here recovery bonds. And I hope that we can show with this innovative solution and this historical solution that we are that is a good way to go forward, and we need results also. That's why the accurate and we need to spend well the money, and we need results also. But when I have this question in my country a lot of times, when the money of the next generation arrive, okay, I say, now we are waiting, but we have 11 billion euros in the cohesion policy from the last MFF. We can use this amount, but I hope that after the last ratification, the Commission go to the markets very quickly to have the 750 billion. And remember another point: financial instruments. Why we are not using this possibility? Why we are not using the national instruments for solvability for the SME? Why we are not using? We need national promotional banks. We have a lot of member states, they have not national promotional banks, but we have the advisory app that can help to have these kind of instruments. And we need this support also for the member states. They don't have experience, or for the regions, they don't have experience for these objectives. We have a lot of money. We need to use very well this money. We have opportunities, but we need to have also we need to spend well also these amounts.
Message understood. Thank you very much. Luis, please.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Thanks for these questions that I think are crucial. Let me start with the timing issue. I think we've all been making the point of the need for continued support. It's very difficult to be specific about the actual timing when we can start thinking about how to withdraw stimulus, and then we can actually do it because of the uncertainties surrounding the outlook. But I think governments will need to be flexible about that and to monitor how labor markets will recover, how economic activity will recover, how the different sectors will come out of this, and then use that type of information to inform their decisions on timing. But I think we're still some way from that. Given, again, the fragility and the uncertainties around the recovery. The other question that you raised was the state of the public finances, and that's a question that will be with us for quite some time. And there, I think there are a number of questions that will be interesting to focus on in the next few months. One is, governments are paying much less in terms of debt service than they did about 10 years ago, or even less. So that creates some scope or some space rather, for maintaining fiscal support without putting the debt dynamics under even additional stress. But the other thing is, looking ahead, I think discussions about the public finances will need to include issues like, what are the fiscal pressures that we'll have to face over the next few years? How much of additional spending on pensions, healthcare, can we expect to have on the basis of population aging alone? What are the pressures related to those underlying challenges that we talked about before? So, an idea of talking about the debt dynamics will need to be informed also by analysis of what the fiscal pressures will be over the future. The other one is, what is the nature of shocks that are hitting our economies? The global financial crisis was very different in nature to the current crisis. But the truth of the matter is that in a space of 10 years or so, our economies are facing two very huge crises. So what can we learn about the nature of the risks, the nature of the crisis we are facing, and then the resilience of our economies to those shocks? What could work better from the point of view of boosting resilience when you are hit by a crisis? Sometimes you can't do much about the type of shocks that are hitting you, but you can do about how resilient you are getting out of those shocks. And a final point on this, is what can we do on the structural front to make sure that our economies have better growth potential, can grow on a sustainable manner at a faster pace, because that will affect the debt dynamics in a very important manner. It's not only what happens to the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio, but also how better growth performance can then put our public finances in a completely different trajectory that will allow us to then face the fiscal pressures that are with us and that will emerge, to deal with the resilience and to deal with all those challenges that come with it. But all that to say that discussions about the public finances will be with us, extremely important. They will shape how we think about our fiscal institutions, how we think about our fiscal frameworks, including fiscal rules in different parts of the world, and basically collecting information on what works best for growth, for social protection, for resilience moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis. Cinzia, I know you have to go, but please, if you have a few minutes for us, it would be great if you could give us your thoughts.
Yes, actually, I would like to make 2 points, one on that, and then what our children can expect for the future. On the point of that, it was mentioned by several of the other speakers, and Luis in particular. I think the perception about debt sustainability and the whole concept of debt has changed in recent years. And I think that there are basically 2 main reasons. One is, of course, now the context of the crisis. We have a huge crisis, which basically has been hitting the entire world with almost no exception. So a situation where it's basically very difficult or even impossible to point the finger towards a certain country or certain region for misbehavior, which was very different from the financial crisis. The second feature of the environment where we live is very low interest rates in a consistent way. And this is a very fundamental feature of the economic environment in which we have been living now for quite some years. And of course, interest rates matter a lot when we need to discuss about that sustainability. So in this sense, the combination of need for fiscal intervention and a context where basically borrowing can be done almost at cost zero has changed very much the way we look at that. Now, I think one very fundamental question is for how long this situation will persist and for how long we will have still room basically to have fiscal support, which is definitely very, very necessary. And this opens a question also in the context of the fiscal governance framework on the EU about the Stability and Growth Pact. I think one question, a more fundamental question, I would say, than when the suspension of the Stability and Growth Pact should be removed, it's really what kind of growth and stability pact we should discuss, imagine having for after this crisis. I honestly have a serious doubt about the fact that the Stability and Growth Pact, as we have it now, can be restated in 2022 or even later. So I think there is a much more fundamental question. And then a point about the future. I have a daughter. One of my daughters will be 20 years old in 2027. So sometimes I wonder what kind of world she will have to face and how she will be, whether she will be able basically to face with a world which is likely to be quite different from now. And there I'm in between 2 feelings, let me say. On the one hand, I tend to be optimistic and say in 5 years' time, hopefully the big crisis will be gone and we will have learned some lessons. She's digitally skilled. She's 14, but she's digitally skilled, like a lot of the lucky kids who actually have access to schools. She will get used to be flexible. She will see that around her jobs will become more and more flexible. that almost no one will have one job in his or her life. So I look at these elements as elements of resilience. This is what Louise was saying earlier. I think we are in a situation where we cannot try to prepare our kids for in a rigid way for a world which is without crisis. This is just unthinkable. We just need to prepare our kids to be resilient. And this is also why I believe that it's crucial in this moment that no kid is left behind. And how important is basically education. And hopefully this will be temporary, but 2020 was definitely not a good year for all the kids in Europe who had to be away from schools. My main concern, and where I'm a bit more pessimistic, is for those young people who are entering the labor market today, who are about to enter the labor market. For them, I think challenges are much, much bigger. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Cinzia. Nora, if you could have a few minutes, so we've run over a bit, but please, yes, if you can.
I will be very quick because it's only on this last question, I think.
Yeah.
And I actually totally, I'm with Cinzia on the points she made. I would only maybe add one thing to it, that I think that this crisis has been very important now, I think, to the highest level, that I think everybody has understood that we need to focus in our policies on young people, and that they are not only and that maybe we will go now beyond the lip service about the importance of education, but also the complexity of the challenges that they have. And I think I'm quite hopeful, and at least at European level, I would definitely hope so, that the next generation of EU instrument is not only called the next generation of EU instrument, but that it will be really accompanied with policies helping this generation. And I think that there are, let's say, promising avenues for that, because I think several commissioners are dealing with the young generation, and they really and it's really now clear that it needs to happen, and also with the involvement of the young generation also, so not only as subjects to these policies, but also to listen to their views. I would add that to the previous speakers. Thank you.
Many thanks, Nora. So just leaves me to thank everyone, thank all the speakers for these really excellent presentations, which have been not only interesting, but I hope useful, and that will help the members in their work and help think about these issues that we're all facing. And also like to thank the audience for the questions and the active participation. Yeah, great. The event has been recorded. It will be posted on YouTube for those who would like to watch again. We'll send the details around. And thanks everybody. Have a great day. Thanks. Bye.